His very own driveway, firmly cemented on maps and in his life, suddenly became the target of someone else's claims. Karen, his neighbor, with a smug smile, declared that part of it belonged to her and confidently hired surveyors to prove her case. She loudly told all the neighbors that Jonathan was abusing his position and had taken over her property. But Karen didn't know that Jonathan was ready to fight to the very end. His evidence and determination would become a cold wake-up call for her, and the outcome of this confrontation would forever tarnish her reputation. But let's start from the very beginning. Jonathan Miller always thought of his home as more than just a building. To him, it was a haven, a place where he and his wife, Sarah, could escape from the chaos of the outside world. The house itself was modest but welcoming, with a driveway that stretched like an inviting arm toward the street. It was here, on this very driveway, that Jonathan had spent countless mornings sipping coffee while the sun rose over the neighborhood. The tranquility of this routine was something he cherished, until the day he found a letter in his mailbox that would disrupt everything. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air carries a faint chill, and the ground is scattered with golden leaves. Jonathan walked to the mailbox, enjoying the crunch of leaves underfoot, his mind already drifting toward the day ahead. But as he opened the mailbox and saw the letter with its stark, official-looking envelope, a sense of unease crept over him. He tore it open right there, scanning the contents quickly. His stomach tightened as he read the words. His neighbor, Karen Wells, was suing him, claiming that part of his driveway belonged to her. "What?" he muttered, disbelief washing over him. His heart began to race as he read further. Karen had hired a lawyer and was demanding compensation, or, worse, a reallocation of the property lines. The absurdity of it hit him like a slap. This driveway, his driveway, had been a part of his home since the day he bought it over a decade ago. How could she possibly think she had any claim to it? He hurried back into the house, clutching the letter. Sarah was in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. She looked up as he entered, her smile fading when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Jonathan handed her the letter without a word. He watched as she read it, her brows furrowing deeper with every line. "This is ridiculous," she finally said, placing the letter on the counter. "We have all the documents. She can't just decide this is her property." Her confidence was comforting, but Jonathan couldn't shake the knot of anxiety forming in his chest. "She's serious, Sarah. She hired a lawyer. This isn't just some petty neighborly squabble. She's taking this to court." Sarah reached out and took his hand. "Then we'll fight it. We've got everything on our side. She doesn't stand a chance." Despite her reassurance, Jonathan felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He went to his study, pulled out a dusty folder labeled House Documents, and began rifling through its contents. There were the original site plans, the deed, and even old receipts from the closing process. Each document confirmed the same thing. The driveway was his. But as he sat there, the question lingered in his mind. Why now? What had prompted Karen to suddenly lay claim to his property? Later that day, Jonathan decided to confront Karen directly. Maybe this was all some misunderstanding. Maybe they could resolve it without escalating matters further. He walked across the street to her house, the letter still in hand. Karen opened the door almost immediately, as though she had been expecting him. She was a sharp-featured woman in her late 50s, with a tight-lipped expression that gave nothing away. "Good afternoon, Karen," Jonathan began, doing his best to sound calm. "I got this letter today. I think there's been a mistake." Karen crossed her arms and tilted her head slightly. "There's no mistake, Jonathan. That driveway encroaches on my property, and I've had enough of letting it slide." Her words hit him like a punch. "Encroaches?" Karen, we've lived here for 10 years. That driveway has always been mine. I have the documents to prove it." "I'm sure you believe that," she said, her tone icy. "But I've had a surveyor look at it, and it's clear as day. Part of that driveway is mine, and if you won't fix this amicably, the court will." Jonathan felt his temper rising but held it in check. "Karen, we can sort this out without lawyers. Let's sit down, look at the documents together, and figure it out." She shook her head. "I don't think so. I'll see you in court." And with that, she closed the door in his face. As Jonathan walked back to his house, the anger he had suppressed began to bubble over. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. Karen wasn't just making a claim. She was declaring war. By the time he reached his front door, his mind was racing with thoughts of what to do next. That evening, as he and Sarah sat together in the living room, they discussed their options. Sarah suggested reaching out to a lawyer immediately. "We need someone who knows how to handle this. She's clearly not backing down," she said. Jonathan nodded, though he hated the idea of spending money on legal fees for something so absurd. "You're right, we need to be prepared." The next morning, Jonathan began gathering every piece of evidence he could find. He contacted the realtor who had sold them the house, hoping for additional confirmation of the property lines. He even called the county office to request copies of the original survey maps. As he worked, his frustration gave way to determination. Karen might have started this fight, but he was going to finish it. But Karen wasn't done either. Over the next few days, she began spreading rumors among the neighbors, painting Jonathan as a greedy homeowner who had intentionally built his driveway over her land. At first, he dismissed it as petty gossip, but soon he noticed the subtle shifts in how some of the neighbors treated him. Conversations grew shorter, smiles more forced. The realization stung. One evening, as Jonathan stood in his driveway, staring at the stretch of asphalt that had become the battleground for this conflict, Sarah came outside to join him. "We're going to get through this," she said softly. "You've always stood up for what's right. This is no different." Her words gave him strength. He turned to her and said, "This isn't just about the driveway. It's about standing up to people who think they can take what they want without consequences. I'm not going to let her win." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the driveway, Jonathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't know how long this fight would last or how it would end, but one thing was certain. He wasn't backing down. Jonathan Miller wasn't the kind of man to shy away from a challenge, but as the days passed, he realized just how far Karen Wells was willing to go to stake her claim. The morning after their confrontation, Jonathan awoke to find a man in a bright yellow vest standing on his driveway, measuring tape in hand. The sight of a surveyor, hired by Karen no doubt, filled him with frustration. How had it come to this? Jonathan stepped outside, his breath visible in the cool morning air. "Good morning," he called out, doing his best to keep his tone polite. The surveyor glanced up briefly before returning to his work. "Morning," the man replied, jotting down notes on a clipboard. "I assume you're here on behalf of Karen Wells?" Jonathan asked. The surveyor nodded. "Just doing my job, sir. She hired me to verify property lines." Jonathan nodded, though inside, anger churned. He watched as the man drove small wooden stakes into the ground, each one tied with a bright red ribbon. These ribbons, fluttering in the breeze, felt like an intrusion, a bold declaration of war. Later that day, Jonathan returned from running errands to find Karen standing near the staked-out area, her arms crossed and a smug expression on her face. "You see?" she said, pointing to the ribbons. "This proves it. That part of the driveway is on my land." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Karen," those markers mean nothing without proper legal documentation. I have my own survey maps, and they clearly show that this driveway belongs to me." Karen smirked. "We'll see what the court has to say about that." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away. That evening, Jonathan and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, poring over their documents. The original site plans, the deed to the house, and the county's property records all aligned perfectly. "It's like she's just trying to wear us down," Sarah said, her voice heavy with frustration. Jonathan nodded. "It's a power play. She's hoping we'll give up just to avoid the hassle." But he wasn't about to let that happen. The next day, Jonathan contacted a lawyer, a man named Michael Hartman, who came highly recommended by a friend. Michael reviewed the documents with a sharp eye, his confidence a welcome relief. "You have a solid case here," he said. "Karen's claim doesn't hold water unless she can produce something more substantial than a few stakes in the ground." Michael's reassurance gave Jonathan a renewed sense of determination, but Karen wasn't done yet. That weekend, she called a meeting of the HOA, where she publicly accused Jonathan of encroaching on her property. Her words were sharp, designed to paint him as a villain. "He's been taking advantage of this neighborhood for years," she declared, her voice dripping with indignation. Jonathan attended the meeting, his hands clenched into fists under the table. When it was his turn to speak, he rose and addressed the room. "I've lived here for over a decade," he began, his voice steady. "I've always respected my neighbors and their property. This driveway has been part of my home since the day I bought it. I have the documents to prove it." Some neighbors nodded in agreement, while others avoided his gaze. Karen, however, was unfazed. "Documents can be faked," she said with a sneer. "The truth will come out in court." As the meeting concluded, Jonathan felt both frustrated and heartened. While Karen had clearly swayed some neighbors, others approached him privately to offer their support. "Don't let her bully you," said Mr. Hanks, a longtime resident who had seen his fair share of HOA disputes. "We've had enough of her antics." The following week, Karen escalated her efforts. She filed a formal complaint with the county, claiming that Jonathan's driveway violated zoning laws. This prompted an inspection by county officials who arrived unannounced one afternoon. Jonathan met them outside, his heart pounding. "We're here to assess a potential property line dispute," one of the officials explained. Jonathan showed them his documents, walking them through the history of the property. After a thorough review, the officials found no evidence to support Karen's claim. They left, apologizing for the inconvenience. But the encounter left Jonathan shaken. Karen's persistence was exhausting, and it was clear she wouldn't stop until she got her way. That night, as he and Sarah sat on the couch, he admitted his fears. "What if she drags this out for months? Even if we're right, the stress alone could break us." Sarah took his hand. "We'll get through it. She's counting on us to give up, but we're stronger than that." Her words reignited his resolve. Over the next few days, Jonathan worked closely with Michael to prepare for the impending court battle. They gathered evidence, including statements from previous owners and historical records of the property. Each piece of information strengthened their case, but the emotional toll was undeniable. Meanwhile, Karen continued to spread rumors, portraying Jonathan as a greedy and dishonest neighbor. Her actions created a palpable tension in the community. Some neighbors avoided him entirely, while others offered quiet words of encouragement. It was a lonely and frustrating experience, but Jonathan refused to let it defeat him. One evening, as he stood in the driveway that had become the center of this bitter feud, he looked out at the neighborhood. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves catching the fading light of the sunset. This was his home, his sanctuary. He wouldn't let Karen take that away from him. Turning to Sarah, who had joined him outside, he said, "This fight isn't just about the driveway. It's about standing up to people who think they can take whatever they want. We're going to show her that she can't bully us." Sarah nodded, her eyes reflecting the same determination. Together, they braced themselves for the battle ahead, knowing that the road would be long but worth every step to protect what was theirs. The day of the court hearing arrived sooner than Jonathan Miller had anticipated. The morning was crisp and cold, and the weight of the confrontation ahead settled heavily on his shoulders. Dressed in his best suit, he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie while Sarah offered him a reassuring smile. "You've got this," she said softly. Her confidence helped, but Jonathan couldn't ignore the knot of anxiety in his stomach. This was his first time in court, and Karen Wells was not going to make it easy. The courthouse was a grand, imposing building with tall columns and a sprawling staircase. As Jonathan and Sarah walked through the double doors, they were met by their lawyer, Michael Hartman. Michael greeted them with a firm handshake and a confident smile. "Everything's in place," he assured them. "We have the documents, the evidence, and the law on our side." In the courtroom, Karen sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by her own attorney. She looked smug, as if she had already won. Jonathan took a deep breath as he and Michael settled into their seats. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The case was called, and the proceedings began. Karen's lawyer started with an opening statement, painting her as a victim of property encroachment. "For years, my client has been deprived of her rightful land," he declared. "The defendant's driveway has extended onto her property, and it's time to correct this injustice." Karen nodded along, her expression a mixture of indignation and self-righteousness. Jonathan clenched his fists under the table. It took every ounce of restraint to keep his emotions in check. When it was Michael's turn, he stood confidently and presented their case. The defendant has owned this property for over a decade, and all legal documentation confirms that the driveway is entirely within his property lines. The plaintiff's claims are not only baseless, but also contradictory to the evidence. The first witness called was the surveyor Karen had hired. The man appeared nervous as he was questioned by Michael. "Can you confirm that your findings were based solely on measurements provided by the plaintiff?" Michael asked. The surveyor hesitated before replying. "Yes, that's correct." "And were you provided with the defendant's original property survey for comparison?" "No, I was not," the surveyor admitted. Michael turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this demonstrates that the plaintiff's evidence is incomplete and unreliable. The original property survey clearly shows that the driveway belongs to my client." Next, Jonathan took the stand. He spoke calmly but firmly, recounting the history of the property and presenting the documents that supported his case. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully, nodding as Jonathan explained each detail. "This driveway has been part of my home since the day I bought it," he said. "I've never had any disputes about it until now." Karen's lawyer tried to undermine Jonathan's credibility, suggesting that the documents could have been manipulated. But Michael was quick to counter. "Your Honor, these records were obtained directly from the county office. They are official and verified." The turning point came when Michael introduced a letter from the previous owner of Karen's property. The letter stated unequivocally that the driveway had never been part of their land. "This letter proves that the plaintiff's claim is not only unfounded but entirely fabricated," Michael said, his voice ringing with conviction. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier confidence visibly shaken. The judge asked her directly, "Do you have any additional evidence to support your claim?" Karen stammered, "Well, I was told by the surveyor that—" The judge cut her off. The surveyor's findings have already been discredited. Without concrete evidence, your claim lacks merit. After hours of testimony and review, the judge delivered the verdict. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that the driveway in question belongs to the defendant, Jonathan Miller. The plaintiff's claim is dismissed, and she is ordered to cover the defendant's legal fees. A wave of relief washed over Jonathan. Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with pride. Karen, on the other hand, looked stunned. Her smug demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of humiliation. She quickly gathered her belongings and left the courtroom without a word. Outside the courthouse, Jonathan and Sarah stood with Michael, the weight of the ordeal finally lifting. "You were brilliant in there," Sarah said to Michael. "It was a team effort," he replied with a smile. "You stood your ground, and the truth prevailed." As they drove home, Jonathan felt a renewed sense of pride in himself and his family. They had faced an intimidating challenge and come out stronger. Pulling into his driveway, he looked at it with fresh eyes. It wasn't just a stretch of asphalt, it was a symbol of his resilience and determination. "We did it," he said, turning to Sarah. "We stood up for what was right." She smiled, and we showed her that we're not to be messed with. That evening, as they celebrated with a quiet dinner, Jonathan reflected on the journey. It had been a battle he never asked for, but one he was proud to have fought. Karen's attempt to bully him had backfired, and the neighborhood now knew the lengths to which she was willing to go. Jonathan hoped that this victory would send a clear message, not just to Karen, but to anyone who thought they could trample over others for their own gain. The driveway, once a simple part of his home, now felt like a trophy. It was proof that standing up for the truth was always worth it, no matter how daunting the fight might seem. The days following the court victory felt like a breath of fresh air for Jonathan and Sarah Miller. The tension that had gripped their lives for weeks was finally gone, replaced by a profound sense of relief and pride. As news of the courtroom verdict spread throughout the neighborhood, the atmosphere around them began to shift. Neighbors who had been cautious or distant during the dispute now approached Jonathan with words of support and congratulations. "You showed us what standing up for the truth really looks like," said Mr. Hanks, who had been a quiet observer throughout the ordeal. Even those who had sided with Karen initially now avoided her altogether, their faith in her completely shattered. Karen, for her part, had gone silent. Her bold accusations and public declarations of injustice had backfired spectacularly, leaving her reputation in tatters. No longer the self-assured figure who dominated HOA meetings, she retreated into the background, avoiding eye contact with neighbors and keeping a low profile. Jonathan and Sarah decided to celebrate their victory with a small gathering. They invited a handful of close neighbors, including Mr. Hanks, to join them for a backyard barbecue. The evening was filled with laughter and camaraderie, the air thick with the smell of grilled food and the sounds of children playing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonathan stood near the grill, watching the flickering glow of the fire pit and listening to the hum of conversation around him. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. For his wife, who had been his rock throughout the ordeal, for Michael Hartman, whose expertise had been instrumental, and for the neighbors who had supported him when it mattered most. When the gathering wound down, Sarah joined him by the fire pit, holding 2 mugs of hot cocoa. She handed one to Jonathan and leaned against him. "You did it," she said softly. "You stood your ground, and you won." Jonathan took a sip, the warmth spreading through him. "We did it," he corrected her. "I couldn't have done this without you." The next morning, Jonathan woke up feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He stepped outside to retrieve the morning paper and paused on the driveway. For the first time, he saw it not just as a piece of concrete, but as a symbol of resilience and justice. It represented every late night spent reviewing documents, every anxious conversation with Sarah, and every moment of self-doubt he had overcome. As he stood there, a car slowed down and rolled to a stop in front of his house. It was Karen. She stepped out hesitantly, her expression guarded. Jonathan's heart quickened. He wasn't sure what to expect. An apology? Another confrontation? "Jonathan," she began, her voice uncharacteristically subdued. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. He had never expected Karen to apologize. "I appreciate that," he said cautiously, unsure of her intentions. "I was wrong," she continued. "I let my pride get in the way, and I caused you and Sarah a lot of stress. I hope you can forgive me." Jonathan studied her face, searching for sincerity. To his surprise, she looked genuinely remorseful. He nodded slowly. "It's going to take some time, Karen, but I'm willing to move forward." She nodded in return, her shoulders sagging slightly as if a weight had been lifted. Without another word, she got back into her car and drove away. Jonathan stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. It wasn't the resolution he had anticipated, but it felt like a step toward closure. Over the following weeks, life in the neighborhood began to return to normal. Jonathan resumed his morning coffee routine, standing on the driveway that had become a symbol of his perseverance. The driveway no longer felt like just part of his property. It felt like a victory, a testament to the importance of standing up for what was right. Sarah often joined him during these quiet moments, and together they reflected on the journey they had been through. "Do you think she'll really change?" Sarah asked one morning, watching the first rays of sunlight spill over the rooftops. Jonathan shrugged. "I don't know, but I hope so. Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes." The experience had taught him more than he ever expected. It had shown him the strength of his community, the power of standing firm in the face of adversity, and the value of fighting for the truth. And while the conflict with Karen had been draining, it had also reinforced his belief in the importance of integrity and resilience. As the seasons changed and the leaves began to fall once more, Jonathan and Sarah felt a renewed appreciation for their home and the life they had built together. The driveway, now free of red ribbons and false claims, was a reminder that even in the face of challenges, justice can prevail.